There's a house in eastern Kentucky where the wind still refuses to blow. That's how the locals speak of it, quietly, as if the house can hear. They say even the crows don't circle overhead. Animals won't cross the fence line, and if you listen close enough, beneath the soil, beneath the silence, you'll hear them. The crying. 47 voices, small, broken, forgotten, still chained beneath the floor. You were never supposed to know about this. This story was meant to rot in the archives of obscurity, buried deeper than the basement where it happened. But you're here now, and once you hear what really occurred in the spring of 1899, you will never be the same again. That is not a warning, it's a promise, because this is not simply about child cruelty. This is about institutional complicity, generational corruption, and the calculated design of suffering for profit. And at the center of it all stood a woman known only as Mother, not a nun, not a caretaker, not even a mother in the biological sense, just Mother Sullivan. And her house of horrors was protected not by shadows, but by silence. You see, every town has its secrets. But very few are this sacred. Very few come wrapped in innocence, covered in dust and sealed with the blood of those too young to fight back. This isn't folklore. This isn't myth. This was an operation. 47 children, from 12 counties, none related, all vanished. No missing persons alerts, no questions asked. Because someone was paying to keep it that way. And if you think this was just the work of one disturbed woman, you've misunderstood how power works. Because monsters rarely act alone. They wear faces you trust. They go to church. They sit on school boards. And sometimes they own the very building you're taught to believe protects you. That's why this story matters. Because it isn't about the past. It's about the system that still breathes beneath your feet. The one you were born into without consent, and the one that feeds off your ignorance. So take a breath. Because after this, you won't get to pretend you never heard. The Sullivan property sat just outside Black Hollow, Kentucky, barely a dot on any map. A one-road town with no sheriff's office, no newspaper, and no one asking too many questions. Perfect. That's how they liked it. A place where people minded their own business, and the price of curiosity was silence. To the outsider, the Sullivan home was unremarkable. 2 stories, whitewashed, weather-worn shutters. A crumbling barn nearby, cattle fencing bowing like it carried secrets too heavy to hold. But locals, they always whispered about the house's odd hours, candles burning through the night. Children's shadows, too many to count, dancing behind drawn curtains. And Mother Sullivan herself, pale as linen, always watching, always knowing more than she let on. She told the town she was taking in orphans. Bless her heart, they'd say. They called her charitable, godly. But no one ever saw the children in daylight. No one ever heard them speak. And no one, not once, ever saw them leave. That's the thing about evil. It doesn't announce itself with horns and snarls. It shows up with a warm smile and a donation to the church. Mother Sullivan understood that. She cultivated her mask with surgical precision, hosting pie socials, donating to the parish, quoting scripture with trembling reverence. She was the kind of woman who knew everyone's name and made you feel ashamed for not knowing hers. But behind the soft voice and folded hands was a machine. It began with missing records, paperwork misplaced, adoptions unfiled. She had help, a clerk in Frankfurt, a reverend in Ohio, a doctor in St. Louis. Each one connected by silence and secrecy, each one paid, either in cash and favors or in something darker. These weren't stolen children. These were disappeared children, taken from broken systems that were built to lose them. And what Mother Sullivan offered them wasn't safety. It was subjugation. Not a home, but a hole in the earth where they were stripped of their names, given numbers, and shackled like livestock beneath the floorboards. And yet no one came, because no one knew, or rather, no one dared to look close enough. You still think this was just a bad apple? Then you haven't been paying attention. Rot like this only grows when the soil is already poisoned. It was spring when they found it. The kind of spring where the mud clings to your boots and the wind carries whispers you wish you hadn't heard. April 1899. A local field hand named Elias Monroe wandered too close to the Sullivan property while chasing down a runaway colt. He never meant to trespass, but what he heard that day would unravel everything. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even human, not at first. It was a sound soaked in suffering so deep it bypassed language, like the soul itself trying to crawl out of a throat that had been silent too long. Elias froze, every hair on his body upright, because what he heard wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, layered, faint, coming from beneath the ground. He ran, straight to the constable in Whitley County, who laughed him off. "Old houses make noises, son. Ain't no ghosts under the floorboards." But Elias wouldn't let it go. He went to the preacher, the mayor, the rail foreman, and finally to the one man who had reason to listen, Deputy Josiah Lane, whose own niece had vanished 2 years prior without a trace. Deputy Lane didn't mock him. He simply nodded and loaded his rifle. 3 days later, under cover of morning fog, Lane, Elias, and 2 townsmen made their way to the Sullivan property. They weren't ready for what they found. The front door stood open, the house eerily quiet, but it wasn't abandoned. The kettle on the stove was still warm, and in the parlor, 4 untouched teacups rested beside an open Bible. They found the cellar door behind the pantry, boarded, chained, padlocked 3 times over. But what truly chilled them wasn't the locks. It was what was carved into the wood. Dozens of tiny scratches, fingernail marks, etched deep and desperate. A language of agony no human being should ever have to write. When they finally broke through, the stench hit first, then the sound. Not screaming, not crowing, just silence. Thick, dead, unnatural. And then one whisper, 2 words, spoken by a trembling voice from the darkness. "Help me." That was the moment Deputy Lane knew this was no case. This was a crime against the soul itself. The lantern shook in Deputy Lane's hand, not from fear, but from something older, something ancient that lives inside men when they're forced to stare into a kind of wrongness that no law, no book, no preacher ever warned them about. The basement wasn't made of stone. It was made of rot. Dirt walls, sweating with decay, wooden beams warped like bones left too long in water, and the smell, like rust, old meat, and childhood nightmares all melted into one. There were children. He counted 6 at first, then more. Some were chained, some weren't. Some didn't even flinch at the light. They blinked like owls, eyes huge, pale, and sunken. Others tried to crawl away, as if the light itself burned them. One child, maybe 7, reached for Deputy Lane's coat, whispering, "Don't tell her we spoke." Another, older, covered in bruises and dried blood, pointed toward the far wall and muttered, "She eats the quiet ones." It made no sense, and yet it made too much sense. The deeper they walked, the more surreal it became. 47 children, some barely toddlers, others on the cusp of adolescence, not a single adult. Rusted bowls lined the ground, each with moldy bits of bread, boiled roots, or nothing at all. Scraps of clothing stitched from old feed bags, newspaper, or curtains. But it was the drawings that finally made Elias vomit. Hundreds of them, scrawled in charcoal and dirt on every wall. Stick figures hanging upside down, figures with claws for hands and eyes that bled. One mural stretched the entire length of the basement, a tall, faceless woman holding dozens of children by strings threaded through their mouths. When the sheriff arrived with reinforcements, the cellar was sealed off. Not because of the crime, but because some of the deputies refused to go back down. They said the air was wrong. They said their ears rang for hours afterward. One man even tore out part of his own beard, swearing he heard laughter coming from under the floor. The Sullivan family was nowhere to be found. Not a single adult on the property. No note, no tracks, just the Bible in the parlor, and the line underlined in red, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." It wasn't just a basement, it was a secret womb of horror, and whatever gave birth to it was still out there. By morning the house had drawn a crowd. Word had spread fast, faster than it should have, faster than reason could contain. Locals gathered like moths to flame, their faces twisted with a kind of hope that made no sense, as if some part of them wanted the rumors to be true. The townsfolk had heard the whispers for years after all, stories about the Sullivan place, tales about strange lights, about children vanishing in the woods, about crying heard in the wind. Now those tales had names, faces, chains. The children were taken into custody, but there was a problem. None of them had birth records. Not a single one. Some didn't speak. Others spoke in gibberish, or repeated phrases in strange, broken rhythms, like they had learned language from dreams, not humans. The eldest girl, who called herself Mercy, told the sheriff that none of them had ever seen daylight before last night. "They kept us under," she whispered. "Fed us songs and soup and stories. But not love. Not once." She drew a shape in the dirt with her finger, a spiral with jagged edges and a cross through the middle. When asked what it meant, she simply replied, "She marks us when we sleep." Doctors came from Lexington and Louisville. They poked, prodded, measured heads and eyes, took blood, but nothing made sense. The children's bone density was inconsistent with their age. Some had advanced tooth decay, while others had never developed adult molars at all. One boy had scar tissue on his back in the shape of wings, as if someone had tried to carve angel's feathers into him, and none of them, had any recollection of their parents. The Sullivan name had long been respected in Newport, church-going, land-owning, quiet. But when investigators checked the town's land registry, they found nothing. No purchase records, no tax documents, not even a deed. It was as if the house and its residents had never officially existed. Worse still, the children began to disappear, one by one, without signs of forced entry, without sound, just gone. All that remained was the spiral symbol etched into their bed sheets or scrawled onto the walls in charcoal and ash. The town had uncovered something monstrous, but they hadn't contained it. The Sullivan story was just beginning to unravel. On the 6th day, Mercy refused to eat. She sat motionless in the infirmary's corner, staring at the wall as if it might move, whisper, or open. The doctors thought she was traumatized. The nurses said she was cursed, and when she finally spoke, her voice was not her own. "She is not done with us," that's what she said, and then she bit her own hand until it bled. The children were placed under armed supervision after that. They were isolated, watched in shifts. Some were sent to different homes across the county, foster placements, orphanages, and institutions that smelled of bleach and loneliness. But it didn't matter, because no matter where they were taken, they drew the same symbol, the spiral, always with jagged edges, always crossed out. And when they spoke of her, they used the same name, the seamstress. Investigators returned to the house, hoping to uncover the truth. They found new horrors instead. Beneath the floorboards, inside a concealed chamber neither mapped nor documented, was a second basement, one that hadn't been discovered during the first search. It wasn't just a room, it was a sanctum. Symbols lined the walls, carved into the stone with surgical precision. Rows of empty child-sized beds. A sewing machine rusted in one corner, surrounded by swatches of skin-colored fabric, none of which could be identified by textile experts. Some of it didn't seem human. Some of it didn't seem organic at all. But what truly broke the resolve of hardened men was what they found in jars. Eyes, teeth, buttons, and a black thread, woven tight like hair, wrapped around handwritten pages that made no linguistic sense. Words rearranged like spells, lines repeated over and over. Her fingers make the world again. Her eyes see the stitches in your soul. She sews what the flesh forgets. The journals were signed, each one with the same name, Matron C. Sullivan. But no such person was ever recorded in Kentucky's birth records. No obituary, no photo, just that name. And as the investigators prepared to leave, one man collapsed, clutching his chest, gasping that he'd heard singing from inside the walls. The official report said structural instability, but locals know better. They say you can still hear the whirring of the needle at night if you stand quiet in the ruins of that house, because the seamstress isn't a woman, she's a wound. 3 weeks after the second basement was discovered, the house was set to be demolished. It was a quiet decision made behind closed doors by officials who were too afraid to speak publicly. They claimed it was to protect public safety, but those who'd entered the house knew better. No one volunteered to do the demolition. The first company hired backed out the morning they were meant to begin. The foreman said his daughter had a dream. A woman with black threads instead of veins whispered in her ear, "You break my home, I'll break your bloodline." The second company lasted 5 hours, until one of their bulldozer operators walked into the woods naked, humming a lullaby no one recognized, and was found days later curled in a fetal position repeating just one word: needles. So the house remained, fenced, condemned, but never touched. And in the weeks that followed, strange things began happening across Newport. Children who had no connection to the Sullivan case began to disappear, just for moments. A few minutes in the yard, a walk home from school, a trip to the bathroom. Each time when they returned, they said they had seen her. "She fixed my eyes," one boy said. "She opened me up and put me back together," said a girl whose belly bore thin red lines that hadn't been there before. The sheriff formed a task force, 20 men, all local. They armed themselves and returned to the house, determined to burn it to the ground. But something had changed. The front door was open, and the house, previously collapsing from age and rot, stood pristine, not a single broken step, no peeling paint. The windows shimmered like mirrors in the dark. They entered, one by one. Only 3 came back out, and none could explain what had happened. One officer quit the force the next day, another took his own life a week later. The third was institutionalized. He kept roaring the same thing over and over again. A child split in half, one side stitched to something else. But it wasn't just children being affected anymore. Men and women in town began reporting dreams, of a woman sewing their mouths shut, of a voice whispering in the dark, "Let me fix what they ruined." And then came the final straw. The mayor's own son vanished for 3 days. When he returned, he had no memory of where he'd been, but beneath his shirt, stitched into the skin over his heart, were 3 words. "She chose me." By autumn, the town had changed. Not in the way a town changes with time, or progress, or politics. This was something darker, subtler. Shadows moved where there was no light. People whispered without opening their mouths. Dogs refused to walk past the Sullivan property. Clocks ticked backward. And every night, without fail, someone in town would wake up at 3:17 a.m., gasping, sweating, hearing the sound of a sewing machine echoing faintly in their ears. Local pastors tried to intervene. They blessed homes. They gathered for mass prayers. One group even tried an exorcism on the Sullivan house from a safe distance. They stood in a circle, holding hands, repeating psalms. But halfway through, one of them began bleeding from the eyes and collapsed. His last words? "She's inside me. She's in all of us now." After that, church attendance plummeted. People stopped speaking of God. They whispered about her instead. The Stitcher, that's what they called her. Not Mrs. Sullivan, not a ghost, not even a demon. Just the Stitcher. Because whatever had taken root in that house wasn't human anymore. It was a force, a presence. Something born from years of torment and pain and the screams of 47 forgotten children. And it wanted to be seen. One day, the town doctor received a letter. No return address, no stamp. Just the words, "You failed them." Inside the envelope was a small lock of hair and a sewing needle. He was found later that night in his clinic, mouth sewn shut, wrists open, and a single word carved into his chest. Witness. By now, the entire town was unraveling. Marriages ended overnight. Children stopped playing. Stores closed early for no reason. And people began hearing things, footsteps in their attic, breathing behind their walls, crying beneath their floorboards. And worst of all, a phrase that would repeat itself endlessly in dreams, in the wedding, and in the back of their minds, "I fix what you abandon." The mayor declared a state of emergency, but no one responded. State police ignored the calls. Newspapers refused to print the stories. It was as if the entire world had decided that Newport didn't exist anymore, that whatever was happening there was meant to happen. And deep beneath the house, beneath layers of soil and cement, something moved, something sewn from pieces, something that breathed without lungs, something that waited. Because the stitcher wasn't finished. She had only just begun. By November, the house was no longer just a house. It had become something else. A breathing entity, a body made of brick and bone, a wound in the land itself. No one approached the front door anymore, not even the brave, not even the fools, because those who had gone near it, curious teenagers, drunken daredevils, desperate journalists, never returned the same. One boy, 17, went in on a dare. He came out 2 hours later. Silent. Hair white, eyes staring forever at something no one else could see. He never spoke again. But every night, he would draw the same thing over and over. A sewing needle, a mouth sewn shut, and a staircase descending into darkness, deeper than any basement should go. They committed him to a facility in Lexington. But even there, he kept drawing. And every time someone tried to take his pencil away, he'd scream, "She's still sewing! She's making more!" Meanwhile, strange things began surfacing in the river behind the property. Not bodies, not debris. Worse, dolls, hand-sewn, stitched with real hair, eyes made from small bones, mouths covered in tight cross-stitch, just like the children had been described. Some were floating, others were stuck in the mud, still upright, as if they had walked there themselves and just stopped. Locals tried to burn them, but they wouldn't burn. The flames would flicker and fade as soon as they touched the fabric, like the dolls were resisting or protecting something. And in the middle of all this, silence from the Sullivans. No one had seen them for weeks. The windows of the house were blackened. No light, no sound. Only the faint vibration of a sewing machine, endlessly humming from the cellar. Then, just as the town prepared to condemn the house, something happened. A letter was found nailed to the courthouse door. It was written in a child's handwriting, crooked, uneven, but precise. "Do and take the house. The house takes you. We are not missing. We are stitched. We are safe. Mother fixed us." There was no signature. Just a single red thread attached to the nail, trailing all the way down to the ground. The town froze. A vote was taken, and the decision was unanimous. Seal the house, never speak of it again. But silence, as they would learn, is not protection. Because what was inside the Sullivan house didn't need to be remembered to survive. It only needed to be left alone long enough to finish what it started. By winter of 1899, Kentucky's frost had crept into every corner of Newport, except for one place. The Sullivan house remained strangely warm. Steam curled from its chimney, as though a great engine were working deep within its bones. People whispered that it wasn't coal being burned, but memories. That the house was feeding, growing. And then came the first official breach. A federal agent, assigned from Washington. He wasn't from Newport, didn't know the legends, didn't care for superstition. His name was Elijah Quinn, a hardened man, tall and sunken-eyed, with scars across his forearms from a case out in Arizona. He thought the rumors were nonsense, just backward town panic. He brought tools, a pistol, and a small team of 3. They entered the Sullivan house on December 5th at dawn. Only Quinn came out. But what emerged wasn't Quinn. His face was the same, his uniform intact. But something was wrong, fundamentally wrong. He walked differently, spoke like a boy, used strange words from old nursery rhymes no one had heard in decades. And he kept asking, over and over, "Is my stitching neat? Mama says neat is important." The government retrieved him within 48 hours, quarantined the site, fenced off the entire property, posted a sign, "Federal property, no trespassing." But the damage was done. Stories spread beyond Kentucky. Dark history circles, occult journals, underground medical communities. Some claimed the Sullivans were part of a failed psychological experiment. Others said the house sat atop a rupture in reality, a place where thought becomes form, where pain echoes forever. A woman from Tennessee claimed she had been one of the stitched. She bore scars across her lips, hidden by powder and shame. When asked what she remembered, she only said, "She sang while she did it. A lullaby I can't forget. And every needle prick. She called it fixing my traw." What truth? No one knew. She vanished days later, left behind only a sewing kit and a lock of her own hair braided into the handle. Authorities denied all connections. They said the stories were hysteria, that the Sullivans were just a poor, eccentric family. But no one bought it. Because by then, the town had already counted the graves, and the number didn't match. Children were found in the basement, but there had been 48 missing. One child, still unaccounted for, still out there. And some believed she wasn't missing at all. She was waiting, ready to become the next mother. The house had been sealed, or so the officials claimed, but Newport locals knew better. Some said they saw lights flickering in the upper window past midnight. Others heard music, soft, twisted lullabies drifting through the trees. But most chilling were the drawings. They began appearing across town. Crude sketches, always of the same figure. A tall woman with a needle for a finger, mouth sewn shut, standing over children with missing faces. No one claimed to have made them. They showed up in schoolyards, inside church pews, even scrawled in charcoal on the sheriff's own front porch. Each drawing was signed the same way. A signature, or maybe a mark. Then the animals started to vanish. Dogs, cats, even birds stopped singing in that part of town, as if something had swallowed the sound. One night, a boy named Thomas ventured too close to the fence, dared by older kids. He returned hours later, naked, shivering, mute. He never spoke again, only drew, page after page of the basement, painfully detailed. Stairs descending in impossible angles, hooks hanging from beams, rows of tiny beds, stained with rust and something darker. His mother burned the drawings, moved out of state. But a few survived, sold on the black market for thousands. Occult collectors called them maps of memory, diagrams of trauma made manifest. Scholars of the strange began to take notice. One theory emerged. The house was not built over cursed land. It had been constructed to trap something already there. A containment chamber masquerading as a home. And the Sullivans? Caretakers. Not killers, but keepers. Of whatever darkness pulsed beneath that soil. But they failed. Whether through madness, arrogance, or design, it escaped. And it needed form. A voice. A body to wear like skin. Some say that's what Mother was. Not a person, not even a ghost, but a concept made flesh. Pain, given agency. And now, with each story told, with each whisper passed, she grew stronger. Because fear is a kind of worship. And Newport had become a shrine. By the start of the new century, the government returned. Not with agents, but architects. They buried the house, literally, collapsed the structure, poured cement, built a community center on top, a cheerful place with bright lights and smiling faces. But underneath the basketball court, the stairs remain, still waiting, still whispering. And some nights, if you press your ear to the floor, you can still hear the lullaby. In 1902, the case was quietly closed. No convictions, no trials, just silence, enforced and well-funded. The remaining Sullivan family members disappeared, some rumored to have changed names, others simply vanished, as if swallowed whole by the thing they once served. The town of Newport moved on, at least on the surface, But something had shifted beneath the polite facades and whitewashed buildings. Children began having the same dream, of a cold basement, of iron chains, of a woman with no eyes humming a song that made their teeth ache. Doctors called it mass hysteria. But those who experienced it, especially the children, knew it was more. Their drawings matched. Identical rooms, identical chains, identical faces. Local authorities were overwhelmed, so they called in the Bureau of Psychological Studies, a shadowy precursor to the modern FBI. The Bureau sent Dr. Langford Hume, a man with credentials no one could verify, and a face no one could remember 5 minutes after seeing him. He carried no equipment, just a small leather notebook and a tuning fork. He spent 3 days in the basement ruins. No one saw him enter, no one saw him leave. But on the 4th day, the dream stopped, temporarily. Langford left behind only one note, scribbled on hotel stationery. The basement is not a location, it's a condition, a memory that nests inside the spine, and it's awake now. Then he vanished, just like the Sullivans. But something strange happened after his departure. A rash of suicides began sweeping the region. Each victim left behind cryptic messages, scratched into walls, mirrors, even skin. She sees through stone. Don't go below. The song has no end. Priests refused to bless the area. Old churches locked their doors. Even graveyards were relocated miles away. Locals began referring to the area simply as the Hollow, as if naming it gave it shape, gave it rules. But rules can be rewritten. Because every few decades, the dreams return, always to the children, always with the same pattern. A figure at the end of a hallway. A lullaby they somehow already know, and stairs that lead nowhere, and everywhere. The Sullivan story never truly ended. Because it wasn't just a family story. It was an infection, transmitted through rumor, ink, and memory. And you, listening now, you're part of it. The question isn't if it reaches you. The question is, has it already begun? They called it superstition, folklore, a town's attempt to explain away its trauma. But what was happening in Newport wasn't just psychological, it was generational, a pattern, a recursion. In 1921, exactly 22 years after the Sullivan basement was discovered, a schoolteacher named Ms. Eliza Greer took her own life mid-lecture. She was teaching a group of 3rd graders when she suddenly dropped her chalk, turned to the blackboard, and began writing the same phrase over and over. The chain sings in silence. The chain sings in silence. The chain sings in silence. By the time the children screamed for help, Eliza had taken her scissors and carved the same words into her arms. She bled out before the headmaster arrived. That same week, 5 of her students began reporting nosebleeds. Not from illness, but from pressure, like something was pushing out from inside their skulls. Their drawings changed too. They stopped sketching flowers or homes. Instead, they drew staircases with no end, windows with no view. And always, a woman made entirely of teeth. The town doctor dismissed it as a flu variant. But a janitor found something chilling weeks later, a folder hidden behind a ceiling tile in Eliza's classroom. Inside were old photographs, not from 1921, but from 1899, pictures of the original Sullivan basement, unpublished, unreleased, and worse, annotated. Someone had circled faces in red ink, not just the children in chains, but someone behind the camera. A woman, unsmiling, dressed in black, standing just beyond the frame in every image, like she was part of the walls. That's when researchers first whispered her name aloud, the matron, a figure who never aged, never blinked, an echo stitched into the town's psychic fabric. Each incident over the years, every breakdown, every bizarre suicide, every dream of the song seemed to orbit her. Not a ghost, not a demon, but a presence, an archetype. The psychological embodiment of control, punishment, and neglect, the monstrous mother of institutions gone mad. And once she enters a mind, she stays there, feeding off guilt, off obedience, off silence. You don't invite her in. You inherit her. Because the Sullivan family wasn't the beginning. It was just her most visible shrine. And Newport, that was merely her first performance. There's a myth in Kentucky folklore, older than the town of Newport itself. A tale passed down not through books but whispers, scars, and sudden silences. They speak of a woman who does not walk but waits, not in forests, not in dreams, but in the foundations beneath homes. They call her Mother Below, and long before the Sullivan family ever bought that funeral home, the land it sat upon was already cursed. In 1810, before the state lines were even fully drawn, a surveyor named Nathaniel Crosby documented an eerie feature beneath the very same property, a natural pit of stone and soil that descended 13 layers deep, each level colder than the last. He called it the Cradle of Rot. Locals refused to farm there. No animals would graze nearby. And at night, villagers swore they heard children crying, faint, muffled, like through damp earth. But here's the truly damning part. In the records Crosby left behind, he noted the pit was not empty. In the lowest tier, he described human-sized holes dug into the rock like sarcophagi. Some still wet, others burned black. And in his final report, now locked away in state archives, he wrote one chilling line: "There are no children buried here, and yet the walls weep." When the Sullivans purchased the property nearly a century later, they claimed not to know its history. But Joseph Sullivan's wife, Lenora, was seen more than once standing barefoot over the dirt at night, whispering in a language no one recognized. Not Latin, not German, something older. Her children would gather around her like disciples, and behind them, neighbors sometimes saw flickers, like lanterns moving underground, too synchronized to be coincidence. Many dismissed these stories, others moved away entirely. But when the 1899 discovery happened, when the 47 children were found chained in that basement, alive, feral, and half-starved, Crosby's writing suddenly took on terrifying clarity. Because the layout of the basement didn't match modern blueprints, it matched his diagrams from 1810 perfectly, every room, every tier, every shaft. As though the Sullivans hadn't built a basement, they had merely unearthed it, and the matron, Mother Below, hadn't come after them. She had been waiting. By the time the authorities dared enter the Sullivan basement with proper lighting and tools, it was no longer just a crime scene, it was a psychological war zone. 7 lanterns went dark the moment the first investigator descended the final stair. Not flickered, not dimmed, snuffed. The air, according to multiple testimonies, became so thick it clung to the lungs, like breathing through water. One officer, a Civil War veteran named Thaddeus Groves, dropped to his knees and began sobbing uncontrollably, whispering, "I hear my daughter, but she's been dead 5 years." That was before they even opened the far door, the one made not of wood or stone but stitched leather, thick, tanned, with child-sized handprints pressed outward from within. Behind it they found a corridor that had no architectural justification. It spiraled downward like a grotesque funnel. Etched into the stone were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of carved names. Some belonged to children listed in the state's missing person reports as far back as 1836. But others had yet to be born. How is that possible? One theory came from an unlikely source, a local gravedigger named Otis Legrand, who'd lived in Newport his entire life. He claimed the Sullivan basement sat on a slip line of sorrow, a place where grief, death, and trauma didn't just pass through, but anchored. He said such places act like emotional vortexes, bending time, not forward or backward, but inward, collapsing the future and past into a single malignant now. Legrand believed the names on the wall weren't just records. They were promises. Whatever lived under that house, he whispered, wasn't eating flesh. It was feeding on futures, on potential, on the kind of light that only shines before the world ruins a child. No reporter printed his theory, but many quietly agreed, because the strangest thing wasn't the children found down there. It was that none of them had names, not one. They responded only to clicks, whistles, and in one disturbing case, the ring of a mortuary bell. It was as if they had been reprogrammed, wiped clean, made new. Not to be children, but to be something else entirely. When the first child was brought into daylight, the entire town square fell silent. He was no older than 6, barefoot, emaciated, and pale like he had been carved from wax. His eyes didn't squint in the sun. They didn't react at all. They just stared, wide, blank, as if seeing nothing, or everything. Sheriff Merton tried to speak to him gently, asking his name, where he came from, if he had a mother. The boy tilted his head, then opened his mouth. And from it came not words, but a series of rhythmic, guttural clicks, like an insect trapped in a phonograph. It wasn't just one child. All 47 exhibited the same behavior. No language, no crying, no recognition of comfort or pain. Their limbs worked, their hearts beat. But these were not normal children. Their minds had been rewritten, or perhaps stripped bare. Doctors from Louisville and Cincinnati came, hoping for psychiatric explanations. They couldn't agree on a single diagnosis. One neurologist suggested mass catatonia, another believed they were victims of a cult-like reconditioning program. But Dr. Eugen Schreiber, an outsider from Vienna who had studied primitive trance states, offered the most disturbing idea. These are not sick children, he said. They are vessels emptied of self, waiting to be filled with whatever the basement gave them. And then came the drawings. Placed in front of crayons and paper, the children, without instruction, began sketching. The same image. A spiral staircase made of bone. A black door surrounded by eyes, and beneath it, a figure with no face, but hundreds of hands extending from its sides. One child wrote under their drawing, "It lives in the hush. It hears the new ones before they come. It takes their name and eats their stars." No one taught them these words. That night, 3 doctors left town without collecting their belongings, and a nurse, Margaret Elms, threw herself into the Ohio River before dawn. Her suicide note simply read, "They weren't saved. They were unsealed." The town tried to move on, but the children never did. To this day, no one knows where they were sent. Some say they vanished during transfer. Others claim they were absorbed into secret institutions. But the strangest part? In every town these children passed through, the missing persons cases spiked. In the weeks that followed the Sullivan raid, reports began to ripple outward like shockwaves across the surrounding counties. The first came from a rail yard worker in Ashland. He swore he saw 3 children walking along the tracks alone, barefoot in freezing weather, smiling. When he called out, they turned to him in perfect unison. Their eyes reflected no moonlight. By the time he reached them, they were gone. Then came the hospital incident in Greenup. A young girl admitted for malnourishment flatlined for 17 seconds, only to sit upright and whisper, "The hush is in the blood now. It learns quickly." Doctors dismissed it as a seizure-induced hallucination, but the nurse present resigned the next day, telling her supervisor, "She spoke in my brother's voice. My brother died 3 years ago." And then, the disappearances escalated. Children vanished from orphanages, rural farms, even locked bedrooms. Always at night, always silently. Some townsfolk whispered about a black carriage, seen idling near schoolyards and poorhouses, its windows dark, its driver faceless beneath a brimmed hat. No one ever saw it arrive. No one ever saw it leave. But by morning, someone was always missing. Authorities began to panic. Newspapers avoided the stories. Church leaders advised families to keep their children indoors and to speak no names aloud after sundown. It wasn't long before folklorists and occult researchers began calling it the Sullivan plague. Not a disease of flesh, but a contagion of presence. Dr. Elias Hunt, a former military psychiatrist, theorized the basement was a breeding ground, not for bodies, but for psychic parasites. Entities that needed a vessel, that devoured identity and left behind something replicating humanity without containing it. One phrase emerged over and over, etched into the walls of rooms where children had disappeared. It watches through what once was mine. The question wasn't just where the Sullivan children had gone, it was what had been let out in their place. And now, whole regions of Kentucky had turned quiet. Mail went undelivered. Schools shuttered without explanation. Towns that once rang with laughter now hummed with a strange animal stillness. By spring of 1900, investigators turned their focus to the house itself, not just the crimes committed within it, but the land it stood upon, and the centuries of silence buried underneath its rotting floorboards. What they uncovered was far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. The Sullivan property had no formal land deed on record prior to 1847, yet it appeared on early settler maps dating back to 1791, listed not as a farm or homestead, but marked with a single word written in faded ink, chapel, and beneath that word in faint Latin, domus ex umbra, the house from the shadow. Records from 1803 described a tent revival held on the edge of the property by traveling evangelists. What began as a spirited sermon turned to mass hysteria when a dozen parishioners collapsed mid-prayer, writhing and babbling in tongues. Witnesses claimed a black wind blew through the crowd, silent, odorless, and ice-cold. 6 people died by morning. Local folklore speaks of an earlier structure long before the Sullivans arrived, a stone chapel with no windows, built by a sect of European settlers who refused to speak their native tongue in public and never entered town during daylight. They were simply known as the Weepers. When the chapel burned down in 1812, the land lay untouched for 35 years, until a man named Thomas Sullivan built over its ashes. The Sullivan patriarch had arrived from Virginia under a false name. Court documents reveal he had been accused of exotic malpractices involving children and animal blood in 3 separate counties, but was never convicted. Why? Because each case collapsed after the sudden disappearance of the primary witnesses. A surviving letter from the builder of the Sullivan home, one Elijah Boone, was discovered in a private archive. It reads, "I was told to dig shallow, no deeper than 2 feet, but my spade hit stone, a flat slab, warm to the touch. It hummed under my hand. Mr. Sullivan told me never to speak of it again. He buried it himself at night." The entire foundation of the house had been laid over something ancient, something unnamed, and something the Sullivans clearly believed should never see daylight. The basement wasn't an accident. It was a design, a chamber, a vault. The floor of the Sullivan basement had always seemed uneven, stone laid over soil, shifting with time. But after the final forensic teams returned, it became clear this was no ordinary foundation. There was a trapdoor buried beneath a layer of compacted dirt and hay, its seams hidden with careful intention. When authorities finally unearthed it, they uncovered a second chamber, far older than the house above it, dug straight into the earth. The walls were blackened, not by fire but by time and moisture, and on every surface were symbols, etched deep into stone, in looping, unfamiliar script that pulsed with a kind of violent elegance. No known language matched the patterns. Experts from 3 universities reviewed photographs, but all reached the same conclusion. This is not from any recorded system of human writing. At the center of the chamber lay a stone slab, crude and massive, the shape of a child's bed, but far older than any furniture in the house. Surrounding it were 4 iron hooks, one in each corner, secured directly into the rock. Nearby, rusted chains lay coiled like serpents, and beneath them, dried organic material later identified as human tissue. But what chilled the team most was what they heard. Several workers reported a low-frequency hum that rose when standing near the slab. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't natural, and it couldn't be traced to any equipment in the vicinity. Microphones couldn't record it, but the sound, or the pressure of it, persisted. One investigator described it as a voice without words, speaking just behind your thoughts. And then came the carvings. Each wall bore its own tableau, grotesque, circular illustrations showing human figures kneeling before towering, faceless forms. children's silhouettes surrounded by flame, and a repeated symbol, a ring of 13 hands, each with fingers broken and bent backwards. The chamber wasn't just old, it was ritualistic, deliberate. And then, sealed behind a slab of limestone, they found a chest. Within it, dolls made of skin, bound with red twine, teeth not from animals, and a handwritten journal soaked in dried blood, its first page simply titled, "The Offering Must Be Pure." The journal found beneath the Sullivan home was more than a record. It was a doctrine, a blueprint for generational horror. Bound in animal hide, the texture felt unnatural, slick even when dry. Every page bled a dark crimson stain around its edges, as if it had absorbed decades of rot, ash, and suffering. The first line was etched with something not ink. To unchain the higher voice, the child must first be made hollow. What followed was a systematic collection of ritual instructions detailing how to prepare the children, how to starve them, silence them, and purify the vessel through endurance. The Sullivans didn't just torture. They believed they were refining, turning pain into power, extracting something sacred through the slow death of innocence. Each section of the journal grew more detailed, more calculated. Charts measured screams, tables compared fear responses. Whole paragraphs were dedicated to selecting the right child, those born under certain stars, those who spoke to shadows in sleep, those whose eyes reflected twice. One entry stood out. It described a ritual called the drowning of the light, an act carried out once every 13 years, requiring 47 unspoiled voices. It required the placement of the children in a circle chained underground, reciting phrases from a forbidden tongue, while one child, the mouth, was chosen to receive the knowledge that would pass into the next generation. And it worked. According to the journal, the knowledge did pass. Each generation of Sullivans claimed a child who saw without seeing, who woke in different places, who could speak in tongues unspoken by men. That child became the next recorder, the next voice behind the veil. On the final page, a note was scrawled hastily, almost desperate. It calls again. The offering is incomplete. We are short by one. The implication, the ritual had failed. Or perhaps it was interrupted, which raises the most disturbing possibility of all. If it was meant to recur every 13 years and it didn't finish in 1899, did someone continue it? By the turn of the 20th century, the Sullivan estate had been sealed, its horrors buried beneath polite denial. But Kentucky whispered. The trees still bent the wrong way near the basement. Locals still claimed to hear chains clinking under the soil. And sometimes, just sometimes, children vanished. No signs, no suspects, just silence. But here's the unsettling truth. The bloodline didn't die. Records from 1912 show a Miriam Sullivan purchasing property in Butler County under a false name. She was just 19, and she traveled with 4 adopted children, all boys, none with birth records. The house she purchased? A converted chapel with no basement, but a trapdoor beneath the altar leading to a dirt chamber filled with iron rings hammered into stone. Neighbors called it a reform house. But at night, strange sounds were reported. Singing, weeping, and once, a scream so inhuman that 3 townsfolk moved away the next morning. It was only the beginning. In 1939, during the Dust Bowl migration, dozens of families moved west. Among them was Robert Sullivan, posing as a preacher. In a small Oklahoma town, he rented a barn and filled it with orphans rescued from the rail lines. Within 3 months, 7 children disappeared, all under his care. No one connected the dots because Robert changed names, changed towns, changed faces. But the rituals stayed the same. In 1952, a journalist named Walter Kinsey uncovered an anonymous letter. It read, "They took my sister. They put her in a chalk circle. They called it the Gathering of Voices. I saw it once. The one in charge had no eyes, just 2 burnt holes and a mouth that spoke for hours without breath." The letter was dismissed as madness, but Kinsey didn't stop. He traced the Sullivans across 4 states, in every county an underground chamber, in every chamber 47 hooks. Kinsey vanished in 1954. The last photo he sent his editor shows a crumbling cabin in Montana. In the foreground, a door, slightly ajar. In the background, barely visible, a child's handprint in dry blood on the glass. You see, what the world thought was history was never past. It just adapted. There's a reason the Sullivan story was never taught in schools. Because it never ended. In 1997, in a quiet neighborhood outside Lexington, a contractor was remodeling a Victorian home built in the 1800s. While tearing down a wall, he uncovered a sealed doorway, one that led to a subterranean corridor lined with hand-carved marks. Some were tally lines, others symbols, occult glyphs, blood-drawn spirals. At the corridor's end was a chamber. Inside, 47 rusted manacles. The authorities were called, but the case was buried under bureaucratic fog. No charges, no press. The contractor? Found dead 4 days later. Suicide, they said. But his note was one line. I heard them whisper in the stone. By 2003, a team of rogue investigators calling themselves the Hollow Archive traced dozens of similar rooms beneath Kentucky, West Virginia, even Ohio. Always the same configuration, always 47 chains, always hidden beneath former Sullivan properties or lands transferred quietly through shell buyers. The group's lead researcher, Eliza Ward, disappeared in 2006. Her last recording contained a voice repeating the same phrase for 6 minutes. They come in cycles of 47 years. The gathering always begins with fire. But the most disturbing discovery came in 2021. A viral TikTok from a teenager exploring abandoned homes showed him stumbling into a tunnel entrance. Laughter echoed in the background. He joked. He laughed. Then he screamed. The video cut to black. The account was deleted, but some saved it, paused the frames, enhanced the shadows, and behind the boy, just before the scream, was a figure. Gaunt, pale, inhumanly tall, with burn marks where the eyes should be. The comments vanished, the user disappeared. But the basement, it's still there. And here's what no one wants to admit. It was never about one family, it was a design. A generational ritual passed through. GH bloodlines, masked in charity, hidden beneath faith. 47 wasn't a random number, it was a covenant, a map of submission, a code of control. The Sullivan family was just the beginning. The chain continues. It waits in silence. And while we tell ourselves the past is dead, something ancient walks the halls of forgotten basements counting down. Not in days, not in years, in children. And somewhere out there, the 47th is being chosen right now.